Another in the series of strategic farming, let's talk crops. Today, we're going to be talking about strategies for effective weed management. We've got a handful of guests on and we're quite dispersed. But on the line today, we've got Dave Nicolai and Jared Goplin, who are on my team with me. We're coworkers. As well as then we have weed scientists on, Tom Peters, who's joint appointment between North Dakota and University of Minnesota, and then Devlin Sarangi, who's our weed scientist here at the University of Minnesota in the corn and soybean arena, I guess. So welcome to those speakers and thank you for tuning in today. I do want to call out some of the generous support we've gotten from the Minnesota Soybean Research and Promotion Council, as well as the Minnesota Corn Research and Promotion Council. So thanks to them for helping sponsor today's program. But with that, I think we're going to turn it over to Tom Peters to kind of kick things off today.
And just before Tom starts, I want to mention that a number of you have submitted questions earlier. We probably won't be able to get to all of them because we, as Ryan mentioned, we had many of them. And so our hope is to be able to post them, so you have access to the answers here on the strategic website within the next week or so. So don't worry if we don't get to your question. If you submitted it early, we'll try to get back to you based on emails. So just wanted to add that little bit in here. But I'm in the Fargo-Moorhead area over here at Moorhead for a Best of the Best program, and across the river, Tom Peters. Good morning, Tom.
Good morning, David. How are you?
Very good, thank you.
So as you said, we have a number of questions, but there's some weed science fundamentals that I think we needed to start the meeting with, and that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to pull up a presentation. Okay, so everybody should be able to see my slide now.
Yes.
I'm going to go to the next one, which is a couple of topics I want to address. So I think weed management starts with weed biology. So we're going to go through some basic principles of weed biology, and then I want to create some awareness. One of them is to carry over, and then the third topic is the performance of our soil residual herbicides. How did they do when it was in a dry year? Is it worth the risk of using them when you don't have rain in the forecast? And then we'll talk about some supply chain issues. And then my colleague, Dr. Sarangi, is going to cover some weed resistance work that his team has been working on. So first of all, weed biology. I, like everybody else, reads the popular magazines, and especially during the winter, we see a lot of articles about weeds, and a lot of times we see these catchy titles. And for me, weed management is about fundamentals. It's about learning about the plant. It's about trying to study how water hemp is different than kochia or common ragweed. And that's a task or a job that I'd like everybody to work on during the winter. So there's 5 different characteristics of weeds that I think it's important that you study. First of all, learning about weed identification. You can't control them if you're not sure what they are. Number 2, the life cycle of weeds. Number 3, when do they emerge in response to other weeds? Number 4, the reproduction. How does the characteristic of flowering on a weed impact the weed as a weed control challenge? And then finally, the seed bank issues. So we're going to go through these. Weed identification is not easy. And I will tell you that it's a lot different in the field than it is in the greenhouse or looking at pictures on the computer. So what I would recommend is, if you're not sure, that you ask for help. Ask your service provider, ask your crop consultant, talk to one of your extension specialists or agents or regional educators. But please get help on weed identification if you're not sure. Number 2, and this is borrowing a slide that Jared Goplin put together a few years ago. I think it's really important to recognize that weeds germinate and emerge at different times during the season. So what this cartoon is trying to do is to demonstrate when weeds germinate and emerge in relationship to the crops, but then also the duration or length of germination and emergence that you might expect. Um, it's nice to know that in the beginning of May, I don't have to worry so much about kochia, um, but I can focus on other weeds. And that's what this is trying to demonstrate to you, is to demonstrate that there is a certain life cycle of weeds. And depending on the season, some weeds will be more important than others. And I think this is especially important for the most important weeds on your farm. So you're going to know what those are and make sure that you can anticipate those weeds and look for those weeds on your farm. Now, Mother Nature often throws a curveball at us. So in the previous slide, I mentioned you don't have to worry about water hemp until maybe the second half of May. I'm sure there's a lot of consultants that are going to say, Peters, I disagree with that. I've seen water hemp a lot earlier, and I have too. In the season of 2020, we saw a lot of germinating water hemp during the first few days of May. So again, the environment is another factor that comes to play, and it'll change some of these suggestions that we have. This is a slide that a colleague at Iowa State put together a few years ago. And what I like about this slide is in Dr. Hartzler's case, he's contrasting velvet leaf, a large seeded broadleaf weed, with water hemp, a small seeded broadleaf weed. And what it's doing is it's demonstrating the temporal difference between velvet leaf and water hemp. The second part of it is it indicates that once water hemp starts to emerge, it's going to continue to germinate and emerge in response to rain events, in response to tillage, in response to some of the drying events that occur following rains. So it demonstrates to us that once water hemp starts, it's going to continue to germinate and emerge. I'm borrowing a slide from a colleague in Colorado, Dr. Phil Westra, and this is kochia. All 5 of these pots are kochia, and you can see they look very different. And if we put the stems up, the stems also look different. So kochia is an example of a weed with an imperfect flower, meaning that the male flower and female flowers are not on the same plant because they don't have the complete flowering structures. So what that means is a lot of diversity, and that's exactly what we have in this picture. And we have the same thing with water hemp. So diversity gives us a lot of change. First of all, as you can see, you can't identify them the same. There's characteristics that are different in each of these pots. But the other characteristics are the germination and emergence timing. It could be the ability to control them with herbicides. It could be weed resistance. It might even be the longevity in the seed bank. So I think it's important to understand how your weed control challenges, how those plants flower and reproduce, and that relates to the seed that they produce. My background is in plant breeding. I worked with plant breeders for many years, and plant breeders are consumed with making very calculated improvements of seeds. So maybe a 1% gain, that might translate just to a handful of seeds on a plant. And it makes me smile a little bit because look at the seed numbers that we get with some of our favorite weeds. Mother Nature and weeds and the production of seeds has nothing, is nothing like what our plant breeders are doing. And it reinforces what the problem is from not getting complete weed control in your field. If you let water hemp, for example, go to seed in your field, you're going to get hundreds of thousands, if not millions and tens of millions of seeds in your fields. So the penalty for the lack of weed control is really tremendous. And then finally, there are tables about how long seeds are viable. And this is an example of water hemp. In general, water hemp is viable for 4 years, maybe 5 years under some conditions. But the challenge is if you don't get good weed control, let's say in year 3, you're right back to the beginning again. So what it means is we've got to put together consecutive, strong control programs across multiple crops. That's the end of biology. So the next topic that I want to get into is carryover. Okay. So I don't think everybody on the call is going to have to consider carryover as a challenge in 2022, but I am absolutely certain that there are some areas in the state of Minnesota where we're going to have some carryover problems, certainly with different products. So there's a few fundamentals that I'd like to go through on carryover. And I'm using a cartoon that was developed by the University of Wisconsin in one of their extension publications. So what it's indicating is time on the x-axis and the percent of herbicide remaining on the y-axis. And that green box is safe zone. That's below the threshold where you're going to have residues that are going to injure your following crop. And what the graph is, or the cartoon is attempting to demonstrate, is that depending on if we had a wet year or a dry year, the life cycle of that product is going to be longer. So let's focus on the text on the right. We have guidelines on our labels for how long products residual will live in the soil and what the likelihood is to carrying over to crops that might follow in the cropping sequence. But those are just what I indicated. Those are guidelines. And the actual environmental conditions, such as rainfall, temperature, those are going, soil type that you have on your farm, those are going to dictate the likelihood of carryover. So my rule of thumb for you is if you go into your weather data from June 1 to September 1, and if you don't measure 6 inches of rain, I think you need to look at some of the products that you used, consider the crops that you're going to plant in 2022, and investigate if you have to worry about any carryover concerns. So for me, 6 inches of rain is the number I'd like for you to use. So I'm going to build this slide for you right away. What are some of the characteristics that influence carryover? Well, you have to start with the herbicide itself. And there's a coefficient that describes how herbicides bind to soil. And it's also related to the water solubility of these products. So some herbicides want to bind to soil. And if they're bound, they're going to be in the soil longer than something that's more available in the water solution and potentially able to leach out of the soil profile. On third on the list is temperature. The best conditions for degradation of products are when the temperatures are between 70 and 85 degrees. Okay. So even though we had a lot of fall rain, I'm not as sure or confident in the amount of degradation that we had in those conditions. And then lastly on the list, like I mentioned, the soils on your farm, including soil pH, because some herbicides are influenced by pH, will dictate the carryover you might concern. Now, I have maybe a related topic to this, and that has to do with the performance of herbicides, especially under drier conditions. So the extension message is use soil residual herbicides. You're going to hear that multiple times in today's meeting. I like to target herbicides to where the weeds are. So in the case of small seeded broadleaves, that means getting them into the surface 1 inch of soil. And that means getting rain on these herbicides to activate them. So I want to make a statement for you. Just because you get a herbicide incorporated into the soil with rain, that doesn't mean that it's going to be available and work for you in soil. It has to be in the soil solution. So I will tell you, in West Central Minnesota and Northwest Minnesota in 2021, it was so dry that herbicide that was incorporated into the soil was bound to soil just because we didn't have any moisture to keep it into the water solution. And that's what that absorptivity coefficient is. It's measuring the affinity for different products to bind to soil. The numbers that correlate with absorptivity is water solubility. So it's interesting for me to compare two herbicides, Outlook and Warrant, that are in the same family. Warrant binds to soil harder than Outlook does. So consequently, the water solubility of Warrant is going to be a lot lower than Outlook. Outlook's going to be available in the soil solution much easier than Warrant will be. And here's a picture of that. I'm not going to spend a lot of time with this, but in the green part of the picture, you can see the herbicide in the soil solution available for uptake by seeds or the shoots and roots of various seedlings. And compare that to herbicide that's bound to soil. So the good news is if we get a rain event, that herbicide will move off the soil colloid and back into soil solution where it can work for you. Okay, just a couple of words about the availability of products. I think the best message I can give to you is to plan ahead. Talk to your retailer, give them an indication of what products you intend to use. And then the second one would be is don't wait till the end. Don't put all of your eggs in the post-emergence basket, but to use an integrated approach, including soil-applied, soil residual herbicides. I would also indicate that some of the herbicides that are part of trait packages might be the products in short supply. So looking at traditional post-emergence herbicides might be a way to buffer against any shortages that might occur. This has been a topic that our friends in industry have been visiting about a lot in winter meetings, and I'm guessing a lot of you have heard their own answers about availability of products. And that leads us into the last topic. It's a topic about herbicide resistance. And I'm going to transfer the baton to my colleague, Dr. Syringi, to lead this conversation. So Devlin, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom. So thank you everyone for joining today's webinar, and good morning to everyone. So my name is Devlin Syringi. I'm the Assistant Professor and Extension Weed Specialist at the University of Minnesota. So this is one of the project of my graduate student who was screening the suspected resistant water hemp samples from everywhere, like pretty much everywhere from Minnesota. So on the right-hand side in the map, you can see those red dots. Those are samples collected in 2020. So you can see we collected just a few samples. I mean, those, when I'm talking about collected, either those samples are collected by my graduate student, or it was submitted by growers, or submitted by our regional extension educators. So we, in 2020, most of the samples came from southern part of Minnesota, except one sample. So that's why 2021, we decided to do a really rigorous sampling. And thanks to my graduate student, he collected more than 100 samples from throughout the Minnesota. He drove across the state and collected all those samples, those blue dots. And also we got about 15, 20 samples from growers and extension educators. So in total, from 2020 and 2021, we have about 150 samples across Minnesota. So today I'm going to show you some of the results from 2020 samples, because that's the research we have finished recently, and my graduate student is right now screening the 2021 sample. So when I'm talking about the screening, I just wanted to let you know that these are the herbicide on the left-hand side that we screened those samples against. So those are all post-emergence application, and we applied them with 1 time and 3 times of the labeled doses. And in the left-hand side, you can see those are the herbicides trade name, as well as their the sites of action group. So for example, Raptor, which is ALS inhibitor. So that is imazamox is the active ingredient, and it is group 2. So similarly, group 9, Roundup, group 5, atrazine. So we have screened all those samples against these 8 herbicides and I think 7 groups. Tom, can you go to the next slide? Thank you. So this is the result from 2020 samples. So we had 21 water hemp population collected from mostly from southern Minnesota. So the initial result is showing that all those populations are resistant to ALS herbicide, and that was pretty much expected to me. And when I'm talking about resistant, I just want to make sure that you understand when we call this population resistant in this case. So if that population had more than 40% survival at 3 times of the level dose, we called it resistant. So we can discuss whether that is an appropriate method of calling it resistant, but this is what the approach we took recently. But we will revise the method, and maybe in future you will see maybe if they survive 1x rate, maybe we can call it resistant. So we'll discuss this. But at this point, 100% population were resistant to Raptor. That means they survived 3 times of the Raptor application, and 66% of those populations are resistant to Roundup, and 14% population resistant to Flexter and atrazine. And we found 1 population which was resistant to Misotran or Callisto. So this is something really concerning, that we are going beyond our Roundup and ALS resistance. So we started seeing the resistance to atrazine, PPOs like Flexter, and HPPDs like Callisto. And also I want to let you know one good thing is we didn't find so far any population which was resistant to glufosinate. And also we saw, like, even at 1x rate, glufosinate was controlling those population well. And but we found some population that were there are some individuals that were surviving 2,4-D and dicamba at labeled rate. So that is another concerning thing, because those growth regulator resistance in water hemp population is on the rise. So in few years, maybe we'll see 5-way or 6-way resistance in water hemp in our state. Next, please. So this is the chart for that 21 population that we collected in 2020. So 8 of the population showed only one-way resistance, which is ALS inhibitor. And then two-way resistance means Raptor and Roundup. So two-way resistance we found in 8 population. Then we saw three-way resistance in 3 populations. So one population showed resistance to Roundup, ALS herbicide like Raptor and atrazine, and 2 population was resistant to Roundup, Raptor and Flexter. And we also saw that 4-way resistance in 2 populations, one from Carver County, another one from Olmsted County. So so you can see like it was resistant to Roundup, then Raptor, atrazine, and Flexter, and another population was resistant to Roundup, Raptor, atrazine, and Callisto. So that means there's multiple resistance is on the rise, and it's just a resistance treadmill, and eventually we'll end up having more population showing resistance to multiple sites of action. Next, please. So this is the distribution from 2020 samples, the one-way, two-way, three-way, and four-way resistance. And those points are showing the resistant population. And we are right now screening the 2021 samples. So eventually by August of 2022, we will update this map and we'll show you that what is the distribution of resistant water hemp population in the state. Also, this spring, we started screening giant ragweed population. And in future, we'll update you about herbicide-resistant giant ragweed distribution in the state as well. Thank you.
Okay, Ryan, it's back to you.
Yeah, all right. Well, Devlin, why don't we stay kind of on that vein here with water hemp and maybe
Sure.
discuss some of these questions that came in related to water hemp, because it seems to be the predominant issue if we look at you know, most widespread, as well as what you clearly demonstrated there with some of the herbicide resistance. So do you want to start maybe with I don't know, do you want to mention about corn and the importance of managing water hemp in corn? I think that's kind of an often overlooked area, I guess.
Sure. So actually, we always tell people that water hemp management is a bit easier in corn than soybean because due to all the resistance issues. But now you think like you have more tools in the toolbox because you have treated soybeans that came in the market in last couple of years. So in the corn, and itself, corn is taller plant and it is more competitive than soybean. But it is very important that you go with a strong foundation, whether you are a soybean growers or corn growers. You need to rely on some of the pre-emergence herbicides because that will kind of give you a like clean start ahead of the season. And then still now we have multiple options for post-emergence in corn that you can use for post-emergence control of water hemp. For example, like all the growth regulator herbicides and HPPDs. Definitely you should check whether you are a sugar beet growers because you might have some of the limitations of using some of those group 27 or HPPD herbicides. But again, like it is always good idea to start with a strong pre's, like you have pre's nowadays, like for example, Acuron or Resicor or Burdick. So those are some of the examples. I'm not endorsing anything, but I'm just telling you those herbicides can give you good control in the early season. And then maybe you have to rely on some of the post herbicides. And we always talk about layering residual for corn and soybean. So if you can tank mix some of the group 15 herbicides like metolachlor or dual 2 type herbicides that you can tank mix and spray with your post-emergence treatments, because that will give you a little bit extra window for water hemp control, because the water hemp can emerge throughout the season. And you have already seen that Tom has described how water hemp emerged later in the season versus some of the other summer annual weeds. And again, like it depends on what is your rotation, what is your where you are at, because you might have some certain restrictions on certain herbicides. But again, this will be my answer. And Tom, if you want to add something to that.
Yes, I do. And Ryan, I'd like to add to what Devlin said, that we got to consider an integrated weed management strategy when we're talking about a resistance conversation. So Devlin's done an outstanding job of talking about the chemical component. I want to make sure that tillage or mechanical control and cultural control are part of this same conversation. So there's a question in the Q&A about tillage. And I will tell you that I'm a believer in tillage. I respect the no-tillers, but I see the benefit of tillage, especially having a clean start in the spring, controlling any emerged weeds that we have, and then the value that we have of using inter-row cultivation during the season to eliminate any weeds. So I don't think tillage by itself is going to eliminate the concerns about resistance, but I think it's another tool that we can use to complement the good herbicide rotations that Devlin's mentioned to us.
I totally support that, Tom. Thank you.
So Devlin, here's a kind of a question. So you've demonstrated some PPO resistance with foliar applied Flexstar in the case of what you're working with water hemp populations. What are your thoughts on this whole, concern with, we use PPOs as soil applied products too, things like Valor, the Sharpen, or not Sharpen, the Authority products, Spartan. Yeah. And they've worked in that system pretty well. I mean, do you start to get concerned with the soil applied PPOs and water hemp?
So I didn't check those population. Those are resistant to PPO, foliar applied PPO. I didn't check them against any pre's, but that is something my graduate student is right now doing. So he's particularly selecting those PPO resistant population and screening them against Valor or Spartan. But again, I'll tell you, based on the literature, we have seen that when you are controlling the weeds at smaller stages, especially like when they're emerging, the flumioxazine or sulfentrazone is controlling effectively those PPO resistant populations. And this is, I'm talking about based on the literature from Illinois, from Arkansas, Palmer Amaranth. They showed resistance to Flexstar and Cobra, but when they applied Valor or Spartan, they are controlled effectively. And I think the reason might be because you are targeting the tiny weeds, which is just emerging rather than a 4-inch tall weed. So I think that makes a whole lot of difference.
Well, excellent. So here's a question, and I don't know, Tom, if you want to take this, but for a grower that's managing both water hemp and common ragweed, what are you thinking about, and what kind of approach are you going to use for a management strategy?
Yeah. So water hemp gets a lot of the billing. I would guess in the state of Minnesota, especially for the soybean producers, there's just as much concern or interest in common ragweed control. I'm going to give you an answer from the crop I work most with is sugar beets. It's clearly a different weed management strategy. Okay. So what do I mean? Well, I mentioned that water hemp germinates and emerges from May through August. We mainly concern ourselves with common ragweed early in the season. So at least in my markets, ragweed tends to go dormant when soil temperatures get into the 80s. So in some cases, we're managing ragweed when we don't have a lot of water hemp yet. The other thing is often it's a different compound. Common ragweed is a bigger seeded broadleaf than water hemp, and it takes a different chemical control strategy to control it. So maybe there's examples in corn and soybeans where it's the same products and it germinates and emerges at the same time. But I would like our audience to realize that from a biology standpoint, I would expect to see common ragweed much earlier than water hemp, at least in some areas of the state.
So Jared, I'm going to jump over to you. You've got a lot of experience with giant ragweed in Minnesota, and can you draw any comparison with giant ragweed versus common ragweed for the growers out there that might be more concerned? As we head to the southern part of the state, common ragweed becomes a little less prolific, and giant ragweed becomes a little bit more problematic or present, I guess.
Jared, can you also add in some of your research on terms of rotation and crop rotation if you have a giant ragweed population that's increasing? What are some other things outside of herbicides? Maybe touch on that as well.
Yeah, so I'll start by using the comment I say often when I talk about ragweeds. Common ragweed's kind of the little brother of giant ragweed. It starts emerging just a touch later. It's kind of a half step behind, stepping on the heels of the giant ragweed in many cases, but they both emerge early. They both have relatively large seeds. The common ragweed just a touch smaller, but managing them are pretty much the same. That tillage, and that's where any of you who have seen any talks I've done in the last 5 years, I've used typically 2 examples. And really, it's a field that has a ragweed population and water hemp. So think about using spring tillage or a burn down application for those early emerging weeds like the ragweeds. They come up and 90% of them are done emerging by June 1st. So even a week, maybe 2, delay in planting, with a burn down or a spring tillage pass wipes out a good chunk of those. So that's kind of your first step of starting clean and at least eliminating half of the weeds. Then on the flip side, water hemp doesn't emerge until later. So putting together that program, you want to make sure you have a good pre that works well on the ragweed and hopefully some water hemp control too. And then deal with water hemp a little bit differently. Maybe that's where the cultivation fits in, or by golly, make sure it doesn't come out of the ground, because that's where resistance that Devlin talked about. It's all after it comes out of the ground. So that's where using those residuals are important. And then what was the second part, Dave?
Well, in terms of a crop rotation, the
sure.
longevity of giant ragweed seed in the soil.
Yeah, and that's the other side, is thinking through, okay, if you have really bad areas and you grow more than corn and soybeans. So I was just up in the Red River Valley yesterday and day before, where guys, are growing 2, maybe 3, 4 crops, and having that crop rotation really helps prevent seed production. Because Tom kind of alluded to that earlier. If we can prevent seed production, 3-4 years for any of the ragweeds, or at least giant ragweed and water hemp, you can get rid of 90% or more of the weed seeds. And just viewing weed management as a numbers game, if you only have 10% of the weeds to deal with, it's a little bit more manageable compared to some of these sort of car crash areas where it's just solid weeds. So really focusing on trying to prevent weed seed production. And that kind of comes back then to, Ryan, some of the discussion on corn, managing water hemp and corn, because more and more lately, come harvest time, there's those little spindly 8-inch tall water hemp plants that have got a handful of seeds on them underneath your corn canopy, and they produce some seeds. And of course that seed goes back into the system and is causing headaches for your other crops. So really focusing on the weed seeds, and, of course, perennial crops like alfalfa and, even small grains, they have a dense canopy early, and you can harvest it before weed seeds are even produced. So crop rotation is a huge benefit there, if it makes sense in your system.
Let's take a moment, and we're all part of this answer. Let's try to figure out which of our common weeds last the longest in the soil. So from a longevity standpoint, let's compare some of our most important weeds and try to rank them.
Let's talk about lamb's quarters. Where does that fit in, Tom? That's fairly long, isn't it?
Well, if we start with just short, medium, and long, I would put it in the long category. Does everybody agree?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
Keep going, Dave. Keep
Yeah,
going.
you often see it in, years ago up by the barn and in the areas where people put manure. It's a very long lasting a weed. We don't have a ton of, situation here with resistance, but it's always a troublesome weed for farmers to, take care of, just because maybe mistiming, perhaps a lack of a getting ahead of it, dry weather conditions, but certainly it's out there quite long. What would you do with redwood pigweed?
So I'm going to call it a medium. Okay. What do you guys think? Would you consider the pigweeds the longevity medium? And I'm just going to throw out 5 years, 4 to 5 years.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now we got to put water hemp in that same area, right,
Yes,
Tom?
let's do that. Let's put them in the same bucket.
Okay.
How about the ragweeds? Jared, we just talked about the ragweeds. How do they compare?
Yeah, so that was my whole 4 or 5 years of grad school, was counting those damn ragweed seeds, and 96% are gone in 2 years if you prevent seed production.
Now that's a giant ragweed.
Giant ragweed, yep. Common ragweed,
Right.
I think, is a little longer. There's kind of a mixed bag there, where some of them I think are degraded pretty quickly, but others persist a little bit longer.
I'm gonna throw out one that I work with in the western part of the state called kochia. And most of the time, kochia is viable for 1 year and maybe 2 years at the longest.
And also, kochia does not have that much dormancy that we see in other weed species. So if you get fresh kochia seed, you can germinate them pretty quickly.
Yeah.
So that's why they lose their viability pretty soon.
Tom, there's a segue here. Is the size of the seed and the depth and the profile. I don't know if you want to comment on that. Larger seed, some of them deeper down, more shallow. Any comments there?
Yeah, Jared just told us that a large seeded broadleaf giant ragweed was only viable for 1 to 2 years. I guess you could say that the ones that are deeper in the soil might have a shorter length than the more shallower ones. I don't know, guys, if that holds up or not. What do you think?
I think it kind of depends. The other thing I always mention with this conversation of weed seed bank longevity is that 2% can still be a lot of weeds.
Yeah.
So some of these that last longer than 2, 3, 4 years, some of them can persist longer. And, so that's where you kind of get into that, conundrum where if you have really large weed populations, a couple of percent can still be a big deal.
Well,
yeah, actually, that's a good point, Jared, because for water hemp and palmer amaranth, you always tell people that within 4 years, you can exhaust like 98% of the seed bank, but think about its seed production ability. So like 95 or 98% maybe it does not make sense if you think about its resistance evolution ability as well as its like huge seed bank. So 2% of a million seeds still like it's a lot of seeds.
So Devlin, what I hear you saying is if you've got good weed control and you've gone through that process Tom was kind of highlighting earlier, where we keep our foot on the gas for 4 or 5 years, you don't want to let off because there's still a substantial potential for weeds based on, even if it's a small percent, the sheer volume of weed seed out there, that there's potential new weed species. They're just a lot easier to manage at that point, but certainly we don't want to lighten up on our management tactics, you think?
Exactly. I mean, we call it like zero threshold. Like we cannot allow any seeds to be produced, even if it is like smaller number, like, like later emerging water hemp. Sometimes the plants are really like small, like maybe a feet tall, and we don't care about them because they don't compete much with our crop. But if you see some of the studies done at Iowa State, like those small plants can produce 5,000 to 6,000 seeds per plant. So now think about like, even if you have 10 plants, you will get like 50,000 seeds easily. So that's why we call it like zero tolerance for species like water hemp or palmer.
See, there's a question a little bit different here about outside of herbicides. Jared, I don't know if you want to answer that. It's actually that's anonymous. Is planting into a roller crimped rye a feasible option in Minnesota for those moving away from tillage as a weed management tool? Okay, so it's a little bit different, you know, somewhat planting green and so forth from a cover area. Any thoughts on that, Jared?
My initial thought on that is in the same vein of weed seed size. So, you know, a large seeded weed like giant ragweed or common ragweed, they can emerge up to 6 inches, 5-6 inches in some cases. Giant ragweed can emerge from, and you know, so really they're able to deal with residue pretty well. That residue is probably going to affect emergence to some degree because it's going to keep the soil temps cooler. But you know, it will depend to some degree on the weeds. You know, the small seeded broadleaves, it might have a bigger impact because they're not, you know, as aggressive. They, you know, they only have so much energy in that seed to get through that mat. So, but you know, it really goes back to the same weed principles of things like ridge tilling and you know, those types of things where you're trying to manage residue and create a mat. So there's certainly some benefit in some cases, some years, but you know, there's a lot of variables there.
So I'd like, Ryan, just one last thing I want before we, Tom has other obligations here and so forth, but getting back to chemistry a little bit, there was a question about Liberty or glufosinate. Maybe we could speak, there's a concern over supply of glufosinate, but also the timing, people not getting results with glufosinate and thinking, well, do I have resistance or are the weeds just too large or dry conditions? So Tom and Devlin, you want to talk a little bit about that because it is an integral part on a lot of the programs out here on glufosinate.
Yeah, I'll start, Devlin, but I need your help on this.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to start with a different one, Dave. I'm going to start with glyphosate.
Okay.
So I got a call in early June from a producer in the Benson area, Swift County, and he was concerned that he had lamb's quarter resistant or glyphosate resistant lamb's quarters. Okay. And he just wasn't killing lamb's quarters with glyphosate products. And the answer to the story, it was the environmental conditions that we had. Hot, dry, not very much humidity in the air. And I think that maybe segues to Liberty. The first thing that everybody needs to know about Liberty is it likes it when it's hot, it likes a sunny day, and it likes a lot of humidity in the air. So those environmental characteristics are going to really dictate, I think, the success that you have with Liberty herbicide. So Devlin, I want to throw that out and maybe you can take it from there.
Okay, so I would just tell my experience from last year because, you know, last year Minnesota was pretty dry and hot during late May and early June. So we had a research trial at Rosemont where we sprayed Liberty at 20 gallons per acre, and we used proper nozzle, we followed the label, and we sprayed when the water hemp was 4 to 5 inch. I know that when you talk about 5 inch, it's something off because it should be less than 4 inch. But when we sprayed, I measured all the water hemp that was 4 to 5 inch tall. And frankly speaking, we didn't get more than 40% control last year. So when I checked back my data on Liberty control of water hemp, it was less, like it was around 40%. So I agree with you, Tom. It depends on all the weather characteristics because when it is too dry and hot, like Liberty loves the humidity thing, and you have more temperature but less humidity, and I don't know whether that will work. And so, but it's not that those population were resistant because we checked that population several years and Liberty was controlling that population very well. So it's not that it was resistant. And tank mixing Roundup with Liberty, I have some problem with this thing because I know from my weed science knowledge, it says that tank mixing a systemic herbicide with a contact herbicide is not a good idea. And Roundup is systemic herbicide and Liberty is contact herbicide. And that's why if you check with some literature or if you talk with some weed scientists, they will never recommend that. But I know a lot of people do that. And some of them also had success in the past. That's why they do that. But last year we did a small trial to check this thing, whether Liberty and Roundup or Liberty with growth regulator, they have some kind of antagonism, or they reduce the activities of other herbicides. So unfortunately, last year Liberty didn't perform well itself. That's why I think our data from last year was not that much reliable. That's why I cannot talk about that. But this year, again, I will repeat that study. And maybe sometime this year, late this year, I can report you back, like whether I saw something. But my knowledge of weed science says don't tank mix systemic with contact. For example, growth regulators or Roundup with Liberty.
So when you're looking at,
I would like to just play devil's advocate just for a minute, Ryan, and say, if I did put them in the tank together, if I mixed Roundup together with Liberty, I would be absolutely sure that I followed the spray quality rules for Liberty and not Roundup. So I would spray the combination with lots of water, 15 to 20 gallons, and I would use a smaller droplet spectrum than what you would probably call for if you were using Roundup alone.
So Tom, you're highlighting some of the issues with coverage. Obviously, now what about weed density or crop canopy? Those kind of things can probably adversely affect coverage too. So something to think about when we're looking at those.
Yep, absolutely.
Yep.
Absolutely.
So do you guys, there's a lot of questions around the current supply issues. I know you addressed it a little bit, but any kind of thoughts on that? We can ask some specific questions as we move through here, but you look at costs and supply, and what are you recommending this year to growers? Are there any kind of things that stick out as things to recommend for, the herbicide component of weed management?
So I'll just finish in 1 minute. So what I have heard so far that Roundup and Liberty supply would be an issue. That's what the speculation is so far. And also I checked with some of my colleagues in other states in the Midwest, like they already saw some price increase on Roundup, like somebody reported me like it was like 60 to 65 bucks per gallon. I'm not talking about Minnesota. I'm talking about some of other Midwestern states. So definitely we are speculating this thing, but Liberty, I have not heard anything about price increase yet. And also I checked with some of our chemical company representative in Minnesota. They told so far the Roundup supply is okay. And also I have heard that Enlist One and Enlist Duo and Extendimax is probably will be available as before. But again, like I don't have any concrete answer to that, like what will be when you are close to the summer. But what do you recommend for that? If you see either price increase or herbicide shortage, maybe first of all, like if you want to get some herbicide, try to get it early. And then if you like to take a different route, maybe try to avoid these herbicides, which would be either like scarce in the market or maybe highly priced in the market this year. Maybe you can work around if you're growing corn or soybean, you have other choices than Roundup and Liberty. And also, again, I will repeat this thing, pre-herbicides would be very important, because if you start clean, if you start with a clean field, maybe you don't need to rely that much on Roundup or Liberty that you used to do in the past. Maybe You can go with one-time post, or maybe you can go with other post herbicides like 2,4-D or dicamba or HPPDs, and you can still get rid of your weeds.
I want to just throw in real quick answer one question, then throw it back to you, Devlin and Tom. There was about the Enlist One and Enlist Dual. We know in Minnesota we have 6 counties endangered species where Enlist Dual is not permitted currently. That may change down the road. There still are tank mix possibilities with glyphosate. And there's been some other changes about timing like R1 and rainfall and so forth. So you have to keep those in mind. You can still do some other things with Enlist. But getting back here before everybody goes is if we have glufosinate concerns and that type of thing, Tom and Devlin, should we be looking at a pre that is more than just one active ingredient? In other words, we have a lot of pre's in the market that are combinations, maybe a group 15 chlorosidomide, group 14, the PPOs. Is a farmer better off to position him or herself with a multi-spectrum pre, just in case there's concerns with glufosinate to have a broader spectrum? Maybe Tom, you want to answer that first in terms of that. You've got concerns on carryover on rotation to sugar beets, I understand, but what's your general feel about that?
I like those packages because there's multiple effective herbicides in them. So at least in principle, those premixes make sense. Now, what I don't like about them is that since they're premixes, the rate per acre of each component is set by the package. So it's not as easy to be precise for what I need on my farm. And you've already hit at it on the carryover concern. Since it is a premix, I've got to be absolutely certain that those 2 or 3 products that are mixed together are going to be safe on whatever I have in the crop sequence with the crop that I'm planting this year. So I think the convenience of those products are excellent. I like the fact that there's effective herbicides that are combined together, but you got to be careful on the rates of each of those and the plant back restrictions that you may have with one or more of the components. Devlin?
I agree with Tom about that packages. You should also, always follow the labels for rates, for rotation restrictions. And also, again, I will go back to Tom's initial comment when we started this webinar today, that try to integrate some other practices that will reduce your weed emergence or weed seed production. There are multiple tools available. Maybe it is too late to plant a cover crop for this year, but you can probably do some tillage. You can play with some row spacing, because last year my graduate student did a project. I like that project because he had like narrow and wide row spacing in soybean, and we saw significant reduction in water hemp emergence, and we are repeating this study this year. So I would definitely love to report back to you once we have finished the 2 years of rotation. But again, you have multiple tools you can play with along with the herbicide, just to be on the top side where you don't need to deal with this herbicide scarcity or the price increase.
Hey, what do you guys think about something I've been calling glyphosate conservation for this year? So folks are really concerned with the supply of glyphosate. And in recent years, we've seen a lot of folks using a full pound acid with their glyphosate applications. What are your comments on putting that rate back to the more historical rate of 3/4 of a pound and kind of making our glyphosate potentially cover more acres and using it where it's got utility on things like, foxtail or lamb's quarter? Any comments on that?
Ryan, actually, I know what you are talking about, but it depends on what are the weed species you have. Because I know a lot of growers, they rely on glyphosate for grass control. So especially in the corn, you don't have many options for grass control, especially if you're taking out glyphosate. But in soybean, you have some choices. You can go with Group 1 or ACCA's herbicide like Select Max or Post Plus or Assure 2, because those have excellent grass control. And second thing is, I don't like to cut the herbicide rate, because especially if you don't have any resistant weeds, and if you even don't suspect anything which would survive the 22 fluid ounces of Roundup, maybe you'd like to do that. But especially if you have weeds like pigweed, and you'll select them for resistance, and eventually like those resistance will stack on each other, and you'll have multiple resistant pigweed. So I am not in favor of any kind of rate cut for any herbicide, because last summer somebody contacted me and asked me if I can split the rate of Group 15 herbicide and kind of go with half and half, like pre's and post, or 1/3 pre and 2 times post. I said I'm not a fan of this thing, because that will eventually promote the resistance, and then you'll end up, because we already saw the report of water hemp and palmer amaranth surviving full rate of metolachlor or dual 2 in Illinois, Missouri, Indiana. So it is everywhere. So eventually you will end up having those weeds resistant to these pre's. So I would always recommend go with full rate, what is in the label, and try to kill most of the weeds which is available which is in the field. And eventually, like if you practice that thing, eventually you don't need to worry about many weeds exposed to herbicide. So my recommendation would be no.
I kind of agree with that, because the worst case scenario that could happen, Ryan, is I'm targeting grasses, so I know I can use a lower rate. But I also have a weed like lamb's quarters in. And the last thing I would want would be selection pressure on a broadleaf weed that has the potential to develop resistance. So I think we have to be careful about that kind of strategy. And I'm going to agree with Devlin on this one. I'd rather stick to the label rates.
So Devlin, you had mentioned using, the ACCAses, the Post, Select, those types of products for grass control. And I've heard that more and more, where people are being recommended, or that's their plan, is to pull the Roundup out of the soybean application, save it for your corn, and then utilize one of those ACCAses to pick up grasses. Now, my mind initially goes to antagonism type issues.
Yeah.
Any kind of words, of wisdom there in terms of rate? If you're going after big barnyard grass and foxtail, and then also mixing it, are we going to be better off to go with a second pass as opposed to mixing it with some of the products it might antagonize with?
Yeah, so my colleague at NDSU, Joe Eichley, he did an excellent study a couple of years back, and he tank mixed some of this growth regulator like auxin herbicides, 2,4-D dicamba, and he showed that if you are tank mixing with growth regulators, you have to increase the rate of your ACCA's herbicide to get like optimum control, and which is not recommended even like by him or other weed scientists. So it is better idea to follow up and go with 2-pass rather than try to tank mix some of the herbicides and increase your rate. But I know last year some of the growers, they increased their Group 1 herbicide rate and sprayed, but still they saw some kind of antagonism. So again, like if you need to really use those Group 1 herbicide, sequential application would be like I'm talking about like grow with Group 1, then come back with Enlist or Extending Max rather than tank mixing them. Any
Devlin,
comments, Tom?
I'd like to add to that. Don't forget the adjuvant when you're talking about the Group 1. So The group ones like adjuvants.
Yep.
So if we're targeting volunteer corn, the second thing is they like a lot of spray volume too to get good coverage. And maybe along with that, I would also think about the tips that I'm using to make the application. So adjuvant, spray volume, and also the selection of tips that I use.
Yep. Thank you.
All right. Well, with that, guys, we are over time, so we're going to need to wrap things up today. So we'll figure out if we haven't dealt with questions. We'll look at the crop news venue for that, and potentially even follow up webinars, I suppose, as we move forward. But I want to thank our guest today, Dave. And do you have any other comments?
No, like I say, we'll try to get to the questions. I think this might deserve a special add in here on our website, because we've got quite a few. I was going to mention, if you're confused by all of our numbers, if folks want to go to this Take Action website, the Soybean Growers has a whole list of modes of actions of the premixes and regular herbicides. So it's hard to keep up with all the numbers and so forth, but just go in and search for that on your browser. But Take Action, they have a nice wall chart, but you can put it online and you can take a look at that. That may help with there. I think you just put it up on the chat, but certainly that's an excellent link and helps you in your planning your rotations as we go forwards. We talk about 14s and 15s and et cetera and all that, and really what those products really are by trade name. And I think that'll help our growers out as well. So that's what I wanted to mention. So the rest is up to you, Ryan.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in today. Remember, there will be a recording of this as well as a short press release that'll come out early this coming week. We want to thank again our sponsors, both the Minnesota Soybean and Corn Research and Promotion Councils. Thanks again for their support. And as you exit today, you'll be asked a short 3-question survey. Please take some time to answer that and give us some feedback. We really appreciate it. So thanks again, everybody.
Thanks, Ken.